Hello, welcome to Making Moves, where each week myself, Ross Hastings, and Kieran Ansell discuss a company that is repositioning somewhere in the world each week for better or for worse. Always taken from a couple of options provided with very little notice by our team. Always discussed in under 15 minutes, always unedited, always unscripted, and therefore always enabled by some sort of liquid encouragement. So what are you sipping on this week, Kieran?
I'm staying with our unofficial sponsor.
The Reserve, Winter Reserve.
It is the Winter Reserve. You're right. I'm actually down to my last can.
There you go. Well,
it has hops.
We are recording this a little earlier than we usually do. So I had to make a very quick choice. So to take the choice out of it, I just went with the same as last week. So I'm on the shine again. Focus, energize, perform better. So why look past that? Okay, this week we are discussing SBS/SBS Viceland/SBS2. In other words, SBS Viceland partnership disappearing, and therefore SBS ostensibly rebranding, but in what actually looks like quite a public kind of brand architecture change that had to be announced as opposed to a rebrand per se. Why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that jumps out to me mostly is that this is it's publicly sort of been going out there as sort of, I think one of the headlines was SBS with bites and things like that. And that's great. That's what they've got to try and do. But it's sort of, it feels a little bit like you're, handcuffed to a corpse. Like, I mean, it's not like a decision to be like, oh, we're going to change and, move. This seems very much like a decision that should have been made a long time ago. Whether contractually they are able to get out of that relationship, but they are one of the last in the world to separate from the Viceland name. So not a definitive or action-orientated move, and to the best of our knowledge that we can find, not a profitable one. So I thought it was an interesting one to talk about in a brand architecture sense. We can talk about whether we think a channel like SBS2 is a brand architecture or a product and service architecture. But it sort of feels like just a formality of announcing that.
Well, I mean, and it seems to have been treated as such. I think the more interesting thing for us to talk about is the brand architecture. So let's get to that, but let's quickly discuss it's literally a rebrand in the sense that they've gone back to the brand name that they had before, the D-brand/rebrand.
D-brand is what it is. It's a D-brand.
D-brand, yes. To SBS2. I think one very quick thing to discuss on this is in a competitive landscape that is largely driven by the products that you have, right? Like the programs you have are mostly what drives choice in this space. I feel like SBS Viceland was one of the few that had kind of a distinctive voice of its own in some way that kind of transcended the programs or the shows that it had. So what do you think of the move to actually just it's a non-brand move, right? Sticking a number at the end of SBS is going from having a brand partnership to give you some edge and distinction and some personality to being the kind of almost the polar opposite of that. So what do you think of the actual branding move itself, and then we'll move on to the brand architecture stuff?
Yeah, I think it's a non kind of move in a way. Like, I think this is a D brand story. I think is kind of sort of fits the obviously part of the deal, and one of the strengths at the time of Vice is all the branding and the Viceland, and so of course that's all what they'd done. So in many ways, it sort of gave up SBS's branding, which is beautiful, by the way, absolutely, gorgeous work that they've been doing over the same period. So SBS itself, obviously, it carries the name, but yeah, it's more than a show. It is the whole channel. It is everything that is on that channel. It kind of becomes the whole wrapper. It's interesting. We can talk about, attaching another brand to your brand or vice versa. In this case, it's SBS's channel.
Sorry, vice versa. Quite like that.
Oh wow, okay. But it is SBS's, channel, obviously. So it typically reads like it's SBS's channel, and this is the Viceland variant of the thing, and that creates a good separation between it and other channels, which is why it's interesting. It didn't really kind of do that well in Australia ultimately. So it's kind of a deal that either way you're kind of gonna wind down there.
You've led us on to the brand architecture conversation quite seamlessly there. So let's dive into that. I mean, it is in some ways a cautionary tale when it comes to partnerships, brand partnerships. And I think one of the interesting things about brand partnerships in terms of the benefits and the payoffs, and also the trade-offs, so at the level of your brand architecture at which you partner. And I think this is quite a complicated one to unpick. Is it really a brand partnership, or is it actually, is a sub-channel of SBS actually a product? In which case it's more of a product partnership. This, at least on the surface, appears more as what I would describe as a brand partnership. But I think there's cautionary tales at all levels. And I think usually you go into these things with an intent and the value exchange is quite clear. But it's then, how do you monitor kind of the upside of those partnerships against what often becomes the kind of trade-offs or potential downsides, and keeping track of that over time across leadership changes, across strategy changes, can sometimes be quite a tricky thing. And depending on how high up the architecture you've done it, the risks almost become greater, which is kind of what we're seeing here, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you're attaching to another brand as a partnership at a brand level. So in this case, I do think very much there's a sub-brand level. It's of SBS carrying its name. Any shows and programs that it is presented by that. It's not a thing versus that. I would more say at a service or product level, which would be more of a, the SBS Viceland hour, or, Saturdays or something like that, that is presented on an SBS channel. So I think that, you get a sort of attached much more. And I think you always got to be kind of careful of what the pros and cons. I mean, one of the best brands of this has always been Nike. They've done amazing work with Apple. That's even when they've run a certain period of time, like Nike Plus and other things like that, have been incredibly propelling of a lot of things. Even though that ultimately wound down, they still have other partnerships in those places. Red Bull and GoPro was one that you feel like, well, of course they belong together. The link is just so phenomenally good. I believe that partnership actually had equity share swaps involved in that as well. So GoPro actually taking ownership share-wise of GoPro, but that link just seems incredible. I guess when your link is that strong, if something does go wrong with the other partner, the risk is there. You are literally getting married. So it is something pretty different. So obviously to de-risk, you can sort of, just have it as a like Yeezy, Kanye West and Adidas, highly profitable, but when things start to sell or they're not the same sort of level of the brand, you can ultimately end it. That's quite different, I think, to this SBS Viceland thing, because I don't believe it was a commercial success either. So this is why I sort of, again, opened at the top of this, which is kind of like, you're handcuffed to a corpse. I think you're going to chop it off.
So what you're basically saying, if you're going into particularly a brand partnership, you do a prenup.
Oh, hell yeah. I think it's really clear to talk about all the reasons it's going to work. Sony Ericsson, totally makes sense. Everyone was shopping mobile phones with megapixels. So you're Sony and you're Ericsson, you got a phone and you got a leader in cameras, and you think, yeah, this is going to be it. That makes a lot of sense. But what does the clause look like in that case with Sony Ericsson? You're entering into an innovation thing. You've got two complicated companies thinking they're going to be able to figure out how to work together on innovation. I think that was one of their biggest issues. While the mobile phone industry is booming, they're unable to innovate.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because you get up to this kind of brand or sub-brand level, and you're starting to get into conversation of, I guess, borrowing versus acquiring. In this case, SBS borrowing cool, as I think has been said in the media, from Vice. If you'd asked me before this all happened, what the agreement was there, I had just assumed that it was some sort of acquisition of a particular editorial part of Vice or something like that. In other words, acquired that brand identity or that brand cool, as opposed to a partnership. At some point in these conversations at that level, the conversation must be around acquisition versus partnership. And to your point, there's often a conversation that's somewhere in between, where there's an equity arrangement. The larger sports stars often have a cut of that, right? Either through royalties or sales or, or equity itself, when it comes to brand partnerships. So I guess that's just an interesting thought when it comes to that marriage and prenup and kind of control factor. The upfront cost is obviously higher in acquisition, but you have more control and I guess manage the potential downside a little bit more, versus the lower barrier, which is a partnership with no sort of equity arrangement, just a strategic partnership with certain terms, certain conditions, but then you're leaving yourself more open to that lack of control and the fact that it could break apart at some point. And what does that mean for your brand?
I think partnerships are the coolest thing you can do. I think they're awesome. Like when you collaborating different brands and bringing unusual mixes together, particularly if they're sort of connected in a, let's say, GoPro and a Red Bull kind of sphere. But when you tie brands together, so that they're now actually going to have a product line or something that carries both the names, as opposed, there's lots of consideration that needs to be brought there, versus just like, here's this cool collaboration.
And there's no surprise that most of the time they have some sort of handcuffs in there, with the equity and stuff like that. But that's usually focused on, okay, let's protect both parties if this thing goes off. And in most cases, that's the ones we hear of, right? To your point, in this case, it didn't. And now it's falling apart. It's a fairly prominent brand that needs to be debranded, rebranded. But it's not because it was a wild success and one party's pulled away. It's because it was a flop. But my question is it a flop because there's no space for a second SBS channel in the market? Or was it a flop because the SBS Viceland brand play didn't work?
I mean, the SBS deal at the time with Viceland, would have been tiny comparative to Viceland around the world and what it's doing and everything. And so its valuation was in the billions. So they may not have had much negotiation power, and maybe the reason why they did go with SBS was because SBS was offering them a whole lot of channel, whereas I'm sure there would have been other deals on the table where they would have been doing, Viceland content on other channels. So, that's an example there where they would have been, we can run Viceland content or shows or hours or blocks. But obviously maybe to win the deal, SBS went, hey, we've got all these other channels and they're all becoming digital at the time as well. Everyone's still trying to figure out how to do that. Maybe it has helped get more data from people signing up to SBS to into that in the particular age demographic.
I'm going to cut you off for the time check, and I'm going to spring a new feature on you. We've got 30 seconds left. So what is Kieran's on the spot, no thinking time headline for the SBS brand?
Know what both hands are doing. Know what you're getting and know what you're giving up.
Perfect. All right. I think we'll carry that feature on. All right. Cheers. Have a good one.
Cheers, mate. Bye.